it was kind of this like, because they can, let's ask them. And we're like, because we can, let's say yes. And what happens is it costs your family. And so we had to really be mindful of our yes and firm in our no. Hey, I'm Andrea Olson. I've been leading worship and training worship leaders for nearly 20 years, and my mission is to support worship leaders just like you in volunteer-supported ministries because I know what it's like. I've been there. It's amazing, but you have a big job, and sometimes you might feel a little bit alone. But I'm here to remind you that you aren't. We'll cover spiritual and leadership growth, practical resources, and get encouragement from other worship leaders from all over the world. I truly want to see you lead from the overflow, not the overwhelm. So grab a cup of tea or coffee and join me. Welcome to the Overflow Worship Podcast. Did you know that we also have an online community specifically for worship leaders just like you in volunteer-supported ministries? It's called Overflow Worship Leaders Online, and it is filled with the 20 years worth of experience and wisdom and resources and tools that I've compiled and also that others have compiled on their journeys. And our goal is to pour it all into you because we believe that we are a part of something so much bigger than ourselves. We're part of something so much bigger than one church. We get to impact the future of worship in our churches. So we actually have the doors closed for enrollment right now, but our next enrollment is coming up in July. So if you want to get on the list to be the first to know when the doors open, just head to overflowworship.com/waitlist and you will be the first to know when the doors open in July. Well, I am very excited about this new series that we are kicking off on the podcast. And I have just a very brave friend who has joined me, and I'm so excited for you to meet her. She is a member at Overflow Worship Leaders Online. She's a part of our program there. And I reached out and said, hey, would anybody want to jump into our new coaching series on the podcast? And she was so gracious to say, yes, I would love to. And so I'm excited to welcome her. Shannon Dane, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, Andrea. Thanks so much for having me and for thinking of me for such a special kickoff for Overflow Worship Leaders Online.
Oh, absolutely. You honestly were the first person that popped into my head. So I am so glad that this worked out.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So would you take a minute or two and just tell everybody a little bit about you? Because one of the things I love about this new series is that I'm talking with worship leaders who have their boots on the ground in the local church. And it's such a great reminder for all of us that we're not alone. And there's people all over the world who are doing this thing week in, week out for the glory of God. So will you just introduce yourself and tell us a little about you?
Sure. My name is Shannon. I come from the Twin Cities in Minnesota, and I've been a worship leader for 3.5 years now. I came into it very unconventionally. I was an accountant early on in life, and then I was a stay-at-home mom, and I was getting ready to enter the workforce again, and the Lord called me into worship ministry at our church. I had been a volunteer at churches as long as I can remember, but it was just my time to step up and take the reins of a team. So it's been a huge blessing, and I feel like the Lord has really been leading me in all the previous seasons of life to be ready for this. So it's really an amazing opportunity to be able to serve with the people I serve with and use my gifts to glorify Him.
Amen. Amen. So would you mind telling our listeners what kind of music do you guys do in your church? Because we have a vast variety. We have some people who they're still doing maybe one traditional service, one contemporary, and then we have, more churches that have all contemporary. Like, what is it like at your church?
So we're a church of about 250 to 300, and we do mostly contemporary music. Because we have a really talented team with all kinds of instrumentation, we often will do hymns because we do have a multi-generational church. And I know that those songs just bless their hearts. So if we can have fun and do it well, then I'm so happy to bless them in their worship time. Yeah, so we do a little mix of both, but mostly contemporary.
Yeah, I love that. I love blending in old with new and honoring tradition and all of that. I think that's so beautiful. Amazing. Well, I know you have some questions prepared, but I want to kick us off a little bit, just break the ice. And I was curious. So, worship leaders all over want to know coffee or tea?
Both, but not together.
Yes.
Yeah, unless I'm singing or leading worship at a camp, where there's a lot of singing, I love a cup of coffee every morning. And whenever I'm singing, it's throat coat, it's chamomile, it's, anything herbal. Love it all.
Yes, absolutely. So, are you like a latte person or are you like a black coffee or coffee with cream person?
I like all the frills. Give me all
Yes.
the frills while keeping the sugar content reasonable.
Yeah.
There's a balance to be had there. So otherwise,
Yes.
I just bounce off the walls. So that's not good for anyone. So I have to have it all in moderation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was leading worship at my church this weekend, and it's so interesting because it's always a conversation before but when we're praying together and just hanging out right before service starts, is, well, all the vocalists are like, I know I shouldn't be drinking coffee, but I am, right? And I don't drink coffee when I sing just because I know that it's better for my voice. But how about you? Are you like a strict no coffee when you're going to sing on Sundays?
Usually Sundays are pretty easy on my voice, I would say,
Okay.
in terms of vocal load. So I will have like half a cup in the morning just for the caffeine,
Yeah.
and follow it up with tons of water. But for instance, I'm leading worship at a camp this weekend at a retreat. So lots of singing. So I'm going to kind of shy away starting tomorrow and leading
Yeah.
through. Yeah, so it's a balance.
Well, now that we've gotten, that important thing out of the way, I would love to pass it off
So
to you.
important.
I know it is. Well, and it's funny because my husband and I, it's not that we don't actually drink a ton of coffee. We just appreciate really good coffee. And so we're always curious about, like all the things that people do. Or when we travel, we try to find like a niche coffee shop and, way overpay for a
Sure.
latte just
You
to
have
taste.
to.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yes. Well, I would love to pass it off to you. And why don't
Sure.
you send me your first question?
So I'm no spring chicken anymore, especially in ministry. And so having kind of come into this, it's not later in life, but in terms of worship people, I kind of am on the older side. And I'm wondering how people balance ministry and family life. I've had corporate jobs before, but you can, once you leave the building at 5 or 6 or 7, you can leave it at home. And I found that with ministry, it's a little more difficult, especially, when you're walking through life with people. It comes up at all hours of the day and night. So I'm just wondering if you have any advice or tips or how you would lead someone like myself to really create and hold those boundaries to make sure family life is healthy and ministry life is healthy.
Yeah, that's such a great question. And that question comes from a place of wisdom. Like you have some life experience and you're in a spot where you clearly want to grow and want to continue with longevity in ministry. And I think you're asking the right questions because those boundaries are important so that we can do this for a long time, because it's not a sprint. And if we try to sprint, it doesn't end very well. And obviously there's sprinting seasons. So I would say the first thing that I tell people is to remember that, yes, we have to have boundaries, but to keep in mind the reality of a sprint season. There are seasons where we do sprint, like Christmas or, Easter or whatever, where it's like, okay, I just know that there's going to be a little bit more. And honestly, it's a matter of, for us, like sitting down as a family and being like, okay, the next 3 weeks or whatever are going to be like this for mommy. And so this is how we're going to support one another. This is the grace we're going to extend. And this is just the awareness that we have. It's kind of being open. However, my husband and I learned the hard way that you have to have an end date on the sprint. Because for us, it was like when we were both on church staff, it was kind of this like, well, just because they can, let's ask them. And we're like, because we can, let's say yes. And what happens is it costs your family and it costs your rest and your sanity. And so we learned the hard way after several seasons of like, oh, well, this yes ended, but now we said yes to this and we're in this season. And it just kind of was like a snowball effect. And so we had to really be mindful of our yes and firm in our no. And that's the next piece of that. So understanding the sprint seasons, but then making sure they have an end date. And then number 2, being mindful in our yes and firm in our no. And that is really hard in ministry because like everything in ministry is good, right? So I mean, you know what I mean? In theory, I'm kind of tongue in cheek there, but it's hard, especially for me, because when I can do something, I'm like, oh, I feel bad because they need a volunteer for that thing and no one is stepping up and I sure could do it. But I have to ask myself, what is the cost of this for myself and for my family? There's a cost either way. But which one am I willing to pay, right? And am I willing to have a little bit of discomfort and maybe a little bit of somebody saying like, oh, wow, like I really thought that you would say yes to that, or whatever. I think in the Midwest, there's a little bit more of that kind of, I don't know if it's passive aggressive or what it is.
People-pleasing tendencies.
And the people-pleasing tendencies, absolutely. But it's important to, say no to those things so that we can save our best yes for those parts of ministry that God has really called us to and equipped us for. So it's not like we just use that as an excuse to say no all the time. But, like our church, I get asked to lead worship for, miscellaneous things quite a bit. And in this season of my life, it's had to become a no for now, not forever. And that's something that I learned from Andy Stanley's book on parenting, actually, because his wife was just like, I want to, but it's at the cost of my attention to my kids. And so there's some yeses that I can give. And I'm giving my yes to, for you, the staff position. And for me, it was a staff position, but I had to put a parameter around that, saying like, that doesn't mean that I'm going to be here every time the doors are open and that I'm going to say yes to every extra thing, because that is something that will cause my family, harm in the long run. So those are kind of the first 2 things that pop into my head. Do you have any follow-up questions?
No, it's really fantastic, and a lot to think about because, at a smaller church, if I don't do it, who will? And so it's overcoming some of that and just really staying close to the Lord and saying, Lord, what have you called me to? And for this season, I've got a teenager, a preteen, and a tween. And so they still need mama, even though they're getting very, very independent, they still need mom. So it's important that I really consider what God's calling me to. So I appreciate your thoughts on that. Yeah,
absolutely. And, with it being a smaller church, I can 100% empathize with that because I was on staff in a church of, less than 200 for quite a while. I was volunteer, but it was a, staff position.
Sure.
And, I had to get to the point where I started to realize that, I was saying the same thing, like, well, if I don't, who will? And I had to go one step further and say, is it okay if no one does? Like, isn't it okay if maybe the rest of the church is given the opportunity to have someone step up, right? Because they're kind of used to certain people stepping in and grabbing the ball and running with it. And it was kind of that way, even when I started to step down from that position, and I took a very strategic, long time to raise somebody up before I fully stepped back. But even at the very end, it was like, well, what if I step off and it falls apart? Like, not because she was amazing, but you just kind of feel like, I don't want to leave her high and dry. And the Lord just had to work on my heart and say, like, this isn't about you. And this isn't about, don't worry about it. I got this. Right. And this is about what I'm doing in the church. And that was such an encouraging thing for me. It kind of lifted some pressure off that I was placing on myself and allowed me to step back and say, like, okay, yeah, like, I'm going to leave this in God's hands and, serve where I can serve. And, just obviously we're honoring our leadership and all of that, but being open about the fact, like, hey, I'm a human, I have a family, and this is what I can give. And I want to give this, but I don't have more than that.
So as a female worship leader, I find myself in a kind of a male-dominated arena a lot of the time. Lots of pastoral staff are men, and even lots of worship leaders are men. And so when I'm trying to bring songs to the congregation, it requires transposition and just kind of making things work for our context and for me personally. And I just wondered if you had any advice in how to lead the best, as a female, to make sure that I still have a seat at the table, a voice in the room, to not lose myself in others' expectations and things like that.
Yeah, that's such a great question. And, inside of our program at Overflow Worship Leaders Online, I feel like that's been a conversation I've had with more people over the last year, which is so interesting. And it's also an exciting thing because it's something that I think is really good to talk about. And, right off the bat, I will say, just remember that you were invited into this position, right? Like, you were asked into this position and you were hired for it, and you're wanted at the table. And so I think that is just something so powerful to remember, because it's easy to forget, right? Like, we're kind of in the throes of the day in, day out. And it's like, I was invited here, and I'm wanted here. And so that's the first thing I always tell people is to remember that. And, it's an important thing for us to keep in mind. And then the next thing is to continue on with confidence. Like, be confident in who you are and who God has created you to be. And I don't know about you, but if I get inside my head, I start to modify my delivery, or kind of like I'm less confident in the way that I deliver, like in conversation or even from the platform. If I really start to think about that a lot and think like, oh, I'm the only woman here, or, whatever, if I kind of allow that to take over my mind, it really does impact, me if I let it. And so just remembering to be confident in who God has created you to be, and that He has given you this gift and has placed you for this time. And that, I will say, I know that there's a lot we could unpack here, but in my experience, a lot of the time, it is a lot in our heads. Like, it's a lot of assumption. And so I think there's value in even maybe, having a spot where you can have that open conversation, right? We do it with Overflow Worship Leaders Online, but even within your church, whether it's like, you and your husband and, there's another staff member or whatever, like a safe space where you can converse about that, and they can encourage you, like, hey, we love hearing you, like, we love hearing what you have to say, and we want to hear from you, we want you here. And I think that's wise, because at least for me, if I do get inside my head, and then I realize, like, well, some of those things that I made up, like, weren't actually real, or they weren't happening. And so that's two things I would encourage you to remember, is just to make sure to remember that you were invited into this, and they want you there. And then number two, to continue to move forward with confidence, because God has given you a voice and words, and finding places within your community to be able to safely talk about that, and maybe some of the things that you're battling with and kind of feeling those insecurities creep in, to be able to talk with someone in a safe space so they can empower you and just continue to reiterate, like, no, Shannon, we want you here. We love you here. And those are those powerful reminders that we all need.
Yeah. To be fair, at my church, they are so encouraging. And I have the best pastoral staff to serve with that I could have ever asked for in this season of life. And they are very supportive. But I know I'm not in the majority, unfortunately. So that's kind of why the question, why I wanted to talk about it today.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. And it's something that I have actually been like more aware of in the last few years. And I don't know if before I was just like, so I just was so focused on what I was doing that it didn't even dawn on me that I was like the only woman. Like, it just didn't dawn on me, which is so funny. And maybe it was like the Lord's protection over me, because he needed me to be focused on what he called me to do with worship ministry and with Overflow. But it's interesting because I think there is just a more heightened awareness to it. And it is important for us to be aware. And I think it's important for us too, as women, to come alongside of one another and encourage each other, because it's nice to know that we're not alone. You know, it's nice to know that we can connect with one another and be like, oh, you're doing this thing too. And oh, you're doing this thing too. This is amazing.
Yeah.
And so that's, I guess, another thing I would say for anybody else out there listening too, is to, like, you know, surround yourself with other women who are in leadership, and maybe specifically in worship leadership, so that you can spur one another on and encourage one another, and you know, talk through some of those challenges that others don't face, like men don't face. Like, for example, like, okay, well, we have to be mindful of who we're having one-on-one meetings with in staff. Like, if it's like, no, they don't have to think about that, and that's okay. But it's an awareness that we have to have. And there's always kind of this thing going on in the back of my mind, like, okay, what do I need to be mindful of in this situation? Not that I'm not safe here, but just like being mindful and proactive and, you know, protecting my marriage and all of that. And so, when it's all men working together, it's feels a little bit more heightened, I guess, when you're the only female in that situation. But yeah, surround yourself with some other women in leadership to encourage you too, and that helps. Now, did you have like you mentioned, you know, even transposing songs and that kind of thing? Did you have like a practical question in there as well that you wanted to dive into?
Well, when I'm transposing, I usually just use the circle of fifths and kind of develop a starting point and that sort of thing. I did have a little bit like a band question because I love some of the Overflow Worship Leader Online resources for keys players. And so I've been faced with, or blessed with actually, a number of piano players who are classically trained, and we use chord charts predominantly. And so I was wondering if you had any tips or any resources that you could point me to, and I'd gladly go look them up online, but of how to make that switch from people who are really chained to sheet music to being able to have a little more freedom and use a chord chart to flow with the band a little more.
Yeah, absolutely. This is such a great question. And I always, whenever somebody asks me this question, I always think of this. I was doing this workshop at a church for a couple of worship teams. Like, they kind of all came together and we did like a one-day workshop in their church. And there was this sweet woman who had been a church pianist for ever. Like, she had been the tried and true one who had been through all the seasons at the church. And she asked a question, and it wasn't like a sideways question. It wasn't biting. It was like so genuine. And she was like, I really want to be a part of this team, but like, I just feel like I'm obsolete now, because she was a church pianist where she would, you know, like, just play these beautiful hymns. I think of my grandma, like she can't play piano anymore, but it's like she could play every hymn in every key and every, song.
Yeah.
And it's
Yep.
like, my heart went out to her. And of course, as the worship leader, that's the last thing that we want. But from that, I realized that it's like, okay, we need to make sure that we're first of all validating those people and what they are bringing to the table and what they have brought to the table. And it's not like, oh, hey, we need you to change if you want to be on the team. And I guess sometimes if there's bad attitudes, that's a whole different conversation. But like these people who are super willing, but just feel like they're stuck in their sheet music and they have a hard time translating. And for you, it's hard to translate a full piano that wasn't meant to be supported by a band, right? Like they're playing absolutely everything. And so it's busy and full and sometimes can get muddy. And so that's kind of the first part of that is just, I walked away from that with the reminder of like, yeah, I need to make sure that anybody on my team who is in that spot, whether it's piano or another instrument, making sure they know that we appreciate them where they're at and who they are and that we want to walk with them. Like if they want to learn, like, girl, like I will teach you. And then as far as resources go, I would say the best segue is to use lead sheets. Like, because that's kind of a intermediary between the full sheet music and a chord chart. And so if they've been playing piano for a long time, like they're probably going to be able to play a G chord or to play a D chord or to even just play like the octave in the bass, and then they could still be reading the lead line. Now, yes, I know that is the melody, and that's like you're still running into them doubling the melody with the vocalist, but that at least gives you a starting point of kind of segueing. And then I would say like that whole concept of rhythm, lead, and glue is a great component to use with them where it's like, okay, we've got rhythm covered with the guitar. And so when we have extra rhythm in the piano, too much is not a good thing. And then the lead line is, the electric guitar maybe. And so sometimes you can double that, but not always needed. But glue, we need the glue from the piano, right? Or the pads or whatever they're playing. And so with a lead sheet, they can still kind of follow the progression because they can see it. It looks like sheet music, but we can say like, hey, can you just like octave in the bass and sustain or hit on 1 and 3 or something like that and just give us some resonance. And that might be a great first step. And before you know it, they're going to be flying through those chord charts. But to kind of get them across that bridge, that's kind of where I would start.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That's super helpful. I'm going to go email people as soon as we're done talking, probably. So thank you.
Amazing. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Well, this has been so fun, and I really appreciate you taking the time to jump onto the Overflow Worship Podcast and take a leap with me and start this new series on live coaching. And so as we wrap up, would you be willing to tell our listeners what your experience has been like at Overflow Worship Leaders Online and maybe one of the most impactful takeaways you've had so far?
Yeah, it's been a few years that I've been a member of the community since I went to the couple of the last conferences that we had in Wilmer. But one of my favorite parts is just when you ask questions or have thought prompts in the online chats. And just having people from all over the country weighing in from their context. It's given me a lot of great ideas to support my team, a lot of great ideas for growth. And I've really appreciated that. I've even gone through your devotional. You have like the Christmas devotional. So I went through that in the Christmas season. And that was really meaningful to me. So you just have such a wide array of resources available. So it's really helped at various times in my leadership.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. We just love having you. We love having you in the community. And I love that we can collaborate together. Like you guys as members support one another too, and jump in and chime in. And I love that. That's what it's all about. So
yeah,
thank you for
totally
being a part.
agree. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Shannon, and to all of our listeners and viewers. Guys, we're on YouTube, okay? So if you haven't hopped onto YouTube and you want to see us, on video and camera, you can do that at the Overflow Worship official YouTube channel. But to everybody, thanks for listening or watching today. And, if you haven't subscribed, we would love for you to do that so you don't miss another episode. And also, if you've never left a review, it really helps us reach more people, and it helps us make sure we continue to deliver content to you that you need that's relevant to your context. So if you haven't done a review, we would really appreciate it if you did that. All right, everybody, that's it. Until next time, keep on thriving.